"Remove that man. He has no right to be here." Those were the first words I heard when I tried to walk into the glass atrium of the new skyscraper rising above downtown. It was my son-in-law, Mark Callahan, standing on a podium with a microphone. In his hand, flanked by city officials and businessmen, his finger pointed at me, sharp as a spear, while two uniformed security guards marched forward. They grabbed my arms before I could even open my mouth. The crowd looked on, puzzled, but Mark's voice thundered over the speakers again. "Escort him out. My name is Henry Callahan, 76 years old, a retired civil engineer who once oversaw bridges, tunnels, and highways that still carry thousands of cars every day. For 4 decades, I gave everything I had to this city, to its people, and, above all, to my family. Yet here I was, dragged across polished marble floors, like an intruder at the celebration of a building that I knew better than anyone else. The irony was brutal. The design that had made this tower possible came from my own hands, drawn on paper nearly half a century ago. As I struggled against the guards, flashes of cameras flickered. I saw Mark's face, 48 years old, confident, slick in his tailored suit, the CEO of a construction tech company that had ballooned in influence. He wasn't just Claire's husband, he was also the man who had found a way to erase me from the story of my own work. Claire, my only daughter, stood beside him. She was 44 now, elegant in a dark dress, her hair tied neatly, smiling stiffly at the officials beside her. When her eyes met mine, I searched for recognition, for outrage at what was happening. Instead, she looked away, as if embarrassed. To see me there, the humiliation hit harder than the guard's grip on my arms. Every eye in the atrium was on me, not with respect, but with suspicion, as though I was some bitter old man trying to ruin a glorious day. My boots scraped against the floor as they pulled me outside into the cold air. The massive steel and glass tower loomed above, reflecting the sky. They thought it was Mark's monument to progress, but I knew what was buried deep beneath its foundations. When I was a young engineer, barely out of my 30s, I had worked on infrastructure projects that demanded both strength and imagination. We built foundations that could withstand storms, designs that would outlast us all. That tower they were celebrating had grown out of one of those designs. I had given the city that blueprint for free, believing it should serve the public, not personal profit. My name had been on the original documents, my signature inked across the approval line. I had thought it was forgotten, archived, dust gathering in municipal drawers. But somehow Mark had found it, claimed it, and built his empire upon it. The guards released me on the sidewalk. My chest ached, not just from the exertion, but from something deeper, betrayal that cut to the bone. I had imagined attending this event as a silent witness, standing at the back, proud but invisible, watching my family prosper. I had never expected to be cast out like an enemy. Across the glass doors, I could still see Mark shaking hands, laughing, his voice amplified through speakers, praising innovation and forward-thinking leadership. And there was Claire, clapping for him, leaning into his side as if nothing had happened. My daughter, for whom I had taken double shifts, for whom I had missed anniversaries, birthdays, dinners, so she could attend the best schools, so she could live without ever knowing the hunger or worry I had known. To see her now, standing with the man who had ordered me thrown out, was a pain sharper than any physical wound. As the crowd inside cheered, my gaze shifted to the young man standing behind them, half hidden. It was my grandson, Ethan, 20 years old, a sophomore at the state university. He had inherited my eyes, grey-blue steady, though right now they darted nervously between me and his parents. He didn't move to help me. He didn't raise a hand, he just lowered his head. That small gesture told me more than words could. He was already caught between loyalty and fear was winning. I turned away from the building, each step heavier than the last. The winter wind cut across the street, reminding me of construction sites decades ago, when I'd stood on half-built bridges, shouting instructions over the roar of machinery. Back then, my voice had carried weight. Men listened, steel obeyed, concrete set beneath my hands. Now, at 76, my words were drowned by a younger man's ambition and my daughter's silence. I walked toward my truck parked down the block, its paint fading, its bed filled with old tools I could never quite part with. As I leaned against the door, I pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook from the seat beside me. Its pages were filled with sketches, equations, calculations made over a lifetime. It was my memory, my proof that I had lived a life of creation. I flipped through until I found the familiar lines of the foundation planther, very lines that had birthed the tower. The drawing was mine. The marks of my pencil, the notes in the margin, the signature in the corner, they were all mine. And yet today, standing before the city, Mark had claimed it as his. The rage built inside me. But so did something else, a gnawing doubt. Had I, in my own pride, given away too much? Years ago, I had believed that the work mattered more than the recognition, that as long as bridges stood, roads carried people home, towers rose safely, my name didn't need to be remembered. But now, stripped of even the dignity of standing quietly at the back of the hall, I felt the weight of erasure. What was the worth of a lifetime of labor if your own blood denied it? I heard the faint echo of Ruth's voice, my late wife, gone these 15 years. She had once warned me, "Henry, you give everything to your work, but someday you'll find nothing left for us." She hadn't been wrong. I had missed so many moments, and in exchange, I thought I was giving my family a better future. But now that future stood behind glass walls, celebrating a man who wanted me erased. The truck's engine coughed to life as I turned the key, but I sat there, unmoving, watching the tower in the distance. Its steel gleamed, but I knew what lay beneath concrete poured over foundations I had designed, foundations that carried not just weight but memory. And within those foundations, deep under the city's feet, was something else. Something I had left behind long ago, a secret that even Mark didn't know. For now, I kept driving, the notebook on the seat beside me. The humiliation of the day burned in my veins, but it was only the beginning. They had dragged me out, erased me from the stage, and called me a relic. But they had forgotten one truth I carried in my bones. I was the one who had signed the ground. They stood on, and the ground remembers. The morning after the ceremony felt like concrete set, wrong, hard, cold, and slightly off, as if the whole slab had warped overnight. I drove into town before the traffic thickened, the leather notebook riding shotgun, and parked in front of the bank I had used for decades. The glass doors opened to a lobby that smelled faintly of floor polish and printer toner. I wanted numbers, not sympathy. I wanted to see the shape of my life measured in balances and signatures. A woman greeted me at the reception counter and led me to a private desk. She introduced herself as Alicia Powell, the branch manager, a careful professional with a calm voice and the patience of someone who has seen people arrive with storms under their coats. She asked for my identification, and I handed over the driver's license and an old bank card that had outlived 3 wallets. While she worked the keyboard, her posture tightened the way steel cables tighten on a drawbridge, slow and inevitable. She explained that my monthly disbursements now came from a family trust and that an authorized representative handled the administration. She spoke the representative's name, and my stomach dropped in a clean, hard line. She turned the screen slightly and tapped a document. It was a scanned form with tidy blocks, the kind of precision that hides all the mess behind it. The signatures sat like islands near the bottom. Mine appeared first, the same slope of letters I had carried since the 70s. Another line held Claire's name, listed as witness. The authorized representative field carried Mark's name, formal and unambiguous. Alicia described the arrangement in bank-neutral terms, a consolidation for ease and security, set up to protect the beneficiary and ensure consistent care. The language was polite machinery. I recognized the gears. I asked for the date on the form, and she read it out. The summer when I was recovering from a back surgery, the year the painkillers made days blend into each other like wet ink. She explained that the account had operated smoothly since, that the monthly checks I received were part of a distribution schedule. She said this with sincere professionalism, not cruelty. A younger teller at the counter had been watching us. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, not knowing whether to look away. I felt heat rise, but held it in place. Yelling at a branch manager would solve nothing and stain the only thing I had left intact, my own conduct. Alicia waited for the blast she must have seen 100 times, from customers who mistook procedure for conspiracy. I told her I needed a printed balance, a copy of any document I had the right to keep, and the contact for the trust's administrator. She printed what policy allowed and slid it toward me. On the page, in crisp text, sat the structure of my dependents. I thanked her. She looked surprised at the word, then relieved. As I stood to leave, I saw the young teller glance at my hands, and noticed the old scars that never quite left men who worked around rebar and saw blades. Her expression shifted. It was small, but I felt it. Outside, the wind cut through my jacket. I studied the printouts on the hood of my truck. Distributions logged on a fixed schedule. Notes indicating authorization by the representative. A number 4, inquiries that connected not to the bank but to a firm I had never heard of. I laid my notebook beside the paper and opened to the page with the foundation lines drawn decades ago. Pencil on paper beside toner on glossy stock, living hand beside administrative certainty. I could see my life divided into 2 columns, what I had built with my own hands and what others now controlled with forms and passcodes. I folded the printouts and slid them into the notebook, not as acceptance, but as evidence. Driving home, I took one unnecessary detour to pass the tower. Workers were rolling up red carpets. The podium where Mark had stood was being disassembled and carried off in sections. It struck me how quickly the trappings of triumph become trash. I parked down the street and sat without stepping out, watching a banner with his company's logo flap in the wind until an assistant unclipped it. The atrium's glass reflected a sky that looked like brushed steel. I kept my hands on the wheel until my knuckles went bloodless, then released them and drove on home. I set the notebook on the kitchen table and pulled the metal cash box I kept in a cabinet near the stove. Inside were remnants that do not fit inside digital vaults, an old pension booklet, tax forms with yellowing edges, a photograph of Claire in a grade school science fair, and a stack of envelopes that I had never bothered to open because their contents always said the same thing. I slit the top of the most recent one with a utility knife. The letter declared, in parenthetical politeness, that my disbursement had been processed and approved by the authorized agent of the family trust, with the administrator's name spelled out so cleanly it might have been etched on a plaque. Placed the letter on the table and set the pension booklet beside it. The booklet still listed me as the primary, my handwriting noting every contribution. During the energy crisis years, when overtime meant heat in the winter and braces for a growing child, the booklet's ink had bled where coffee once spilled. I thought about how many nights I had chosen work, because work was the one arena where effort still bent reality. Meanwhile, family had its own physics, slippery and often immune to force. A phone vibrated on the counter. I had left it on silent. 3 messages from a number I recognized, but had not saved as a contact. Claire's short notes asked if I was home and whether I was planning to cause more trouble. She reminded me that visibility mattered for marks, investors, and that my presence made people anxious. When she said anxious, she meant embarrassed. When she mentioned investors, she meant power. I put the phone face down and let the buzzing die in the wood grain. The front door opened without a knock. Ethan stepped inside, not because he had a key, but because I never locked it during daylight. He was 20, my grandson, an engineering student with a quiet manner and a furrow that stayed at the center of his forehead even when he laughed. He wore a jacket with his father's company's logo stitched on the chest. He took in the papers on the table, the notebook, the opened envelopes, and stopped a few paces in, unsure whether to sit or stand. He greeted me without raising his voice, his words careful and formal. A young man trying to honor every person in the room without choosing between them. I introduced him once in my mind, as if the room needed to understand who had entered. He was the boy who once watched me line up bricks along the garden path and asked why every other one was offset. He was the same boy who had outgrown childhood with clean precision, adopting the language of code and venture and whatever else this era demanded. He belonged to both worlds and to neither. He hovered by the table and looked at the stack of checks I had left uncashed. I told him they were the monthly allowances the trust sent, and then I explained what the bank had confirmed. He listened without interrupting. His face tightened when I said his mother's name appeared as witness. He tried to soften the blow by suggesting there must have been good intentions. He said it like someone repeating a lesson he had been taught. To believe, I did not ask him whose idea that lesson was. I did not need him to pick sides in my kitchen. He asked about the ceremony. I summarized the entrance, the order for removal, the escort, the applause that continued behind glass. I spared him the specific humiliation. I did not want to salt the day with play-by-play. He glanced again at the notebook, and I noticed his eyes rest on the foundation plan. He recognized the geometry and the annotations. He asked how long ago I had drawn those lines. I gave him the year. He did the math in his head and understood how long some structures stand and how quickly memory can be renovated beyond recognition. I sent him to the garage to bring in a metal box I kept on a high shelf. He moved through the clutter as if walking a job site, careful and efficient. When he set the box down, dust lifted and caught the light. Inside were small tokens of the trade, an old slide rule, brass calipers, a measuring tape with a broken clip that still snapped true, and a photograph of men in orange vests standing against a skyline under construction. He picked up the slide, rule, and tested the motion like someone testing whether an heirloom still has purpose. I told him it was the tool that decided the span on a bridge he had driven 200 times without noticing the view. He said he would like to keep it. I told him to earn it first. Those words came out with more steel than I intended. He nodded without offense. He understood that tools measure character as much as distance. He asked whether I would confront his parents. I said I had no appetite for front yard scenes or boardroom theatrics. I described a visit to the bank, a request for documents, and the next steps: assembling records, understanding the trust's formation, studying what leverage existed. I explained that restraint builds a better foundation than fury. He seemed relieved by the calm. Then he glanced again at the uncashed checks, and I saw questions forming that he did not ask. He was weighing loyalty against fairness and wishing the math gave painless answers. When he left, he looked like a boy stepping off a truss into air for the first time, trusting the harness but not entirely sure who had tied the knots. I watched his car back out and disappear down the street. Silence returned. I gathered every monthly check on the table and took them outside. The wind had picked up. On the porch, I tore each check across the routing numbers and let the pieces fall into a metal trash can I used for yard burnings. I did not light them. I wanted the act visible but reversible. A neighbor across the way paused with a rake in his hands and looked over curiously. I nodded once. He nodded back and returned to leaves. That small exchange steadied my hands more than any speech could have. If anyone asked why I tore money in a world hungry for it, I would have answered that dignity is its own currency and sometimes the only one a person can mint for himself. Inside again, I sorted the documents into stacks. Bank, pension, trust. I made a ledger entry in the notebook, black pen on ruled paper, with a simple label for what the morning had taught me. Under that, I copied the trust's contact information from the printout and drew a box around Mark's name, a shape I could spear with a pen later if I needed the satisfaction. I turned to another page and sketched the outline of the tower's footprint as I remembered it from the public plans. The corners, the service core, the basement levels, the path of plumbing and electrical. I let my memory work through the strata. Beneath, down to the dense layers where we poured concrete that never sees sunlight. Somewhere in that depth sat something I had left when I was a younger man who still believed time would not turn against him. Late afternoon bled into early evening. I put on a coat and drove to Claire's neighborhood. The houses there had uniform hedges and driveways wide enough to accept any arrival without dents or apologies. I parked at the curb and sat without turning off the engine, watching my daughter's home lighting shift from day to night. Through the front window I saw silhouettes move, one tall profile unmistakably Mark's, one figure in motion that matched my daughter's rhythm, and, for a brief second, a third that might have been Ethan. I did not ring the bell. I left an envelope in the mailbox with copies of the bank printouts and a note of 3 sentences written without accusation. I stated what the bank showed, that I had the documents, and that I would be seeking clarification in writing from the trust administrator. I added that I wanted the truth, not a spectacle. Then I drove away before I had to see anyone open the door. Back home, I cooked something basic and ate standing by the sink. The clock ticked, the kind of sound one forgets until it becomes the loudest thing in a room. When I finished, I washed the plate and set it to dry. I took the notebook to the dining table and opened to the old foundation plan. I laid a sheet of tracing paper over it and began to outline the key features, the way I used to prepare for site meetings. The work steadied my breathing. My hand remembered angles and distances better than my mind remembered the softness of old arguments. When I finished, I taped the tracing to the wall beside the door and pinned the bank letter next to it. Between the two, I drew a fine red line with a carpenter's pencil, a habit from years of marking measurement runs. On one end, the weight of concrete, on the other, the weight of ink. I slept lightly and woke to the kind of grey dawn that makes cities look honest. Before 7, an email arrived from a legal assistant at the trust firm. The tone was cordial and crisp. It explained that the arrangement had been implemented for my benefit during a difficult medical period and that all actions had complied with applicable law. It stated that my disbursements would continue and that any change would require a formal review and mutual consent. The words mutual consent read like a door with the lock on the wrong side. I replied requesting copies of every authorization bearing my name and the context for each signature. I asked for the notary logs and any witness statements. I kept my sentences short. I did not include any word heavier than necessary. Paperwork speaks its own language, and it is always a mistake to add adjectives when nouns will suffice. By mid-morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside were photocopies that smelled faintly of toner, the way new buildings carry the ghost of ground they displaced. The forms told the story I had already learned, a trust established at the peak of my post-surgery confusion, a consolidation executed under the rationale of protection, signatures aligned neatly across lines like rivets. My name appeared where it needed to appear. Claire's name appeared as witness. A notary seal sat like a stamp of history. The last page included a signature block for the authorized representative. I set the copies in order and noticed a notation I had missed at the bank, a clause about communications during the setup period, listing a temporary address where paperwork had been mailed while I was in rehab. The address belonged to my daughter's house. I stared at that line until the type blurred. There it was, plain and fixed. The conduit had not been my home. The correspondence had gone through my child. I imagined the envelopes arriving, the stack building on the hall table, the conversation where someone explained that these forms were for my protection, that it was simpler this way, that the old way was too messy and too slow. I pictured an evening where she considered whether to call me and decided against it because the timing would be awkward and the rationale felt sound. I pictured she told herself that this was what a responsible daughter does. That story is always tidy in the moment and always ugly in the retelling. I stepped outside to clear my head and found the trash. Can still holding the torn checks from the afternoon before. A thin layer of frost had formed on the paper edges. I stirred the pieces with a stick and then left them as they were, half destroyed and half intact, a better metaphor than anything I could write in the notebook. A delivery truck rolled past. The driver lifting a hand in a small salute the way working people do when they recognize one of their own. I returned the wave. There is a language built into simple gestures that does not require permission from the powerful to be understood by noon. I had sketched a rough timeline on a sheet of butcher paper stretched across the table, the surgery, the rehab weeks, the trust date, the first disbursement, the shift in bank routing data. The night I realized the checks all bore the same administrator signature. Underneath the timeline, I listed the people who had stood near each milestone. I put Mark's name beside most of them. I put Claire's beside the key ones. Then I drew a circle around Ethan's name and left it empty. People underestimate the strength of an empty circle. It is a promise that space will be filled either with proof or with grace. Afternoon light slanted across the room. I shut my eyes for a minute and let old job sites unspool behind them. Storm drains, excavation pits, the smell of wet earth when a trench meets groundwater, the thud of boots on plywood straddling voids. When I opened them, the present was still. Here, I wrote an agenda on an index card I would keep in my breast pocket, obtain certified copies of the trust paperwork, request the rehab facilities, sign in and sign out logs for the relevant period, search my old files for any letters I might have filed and forgotten, schedule an appointment at City Records for access to archived project submissions, prepare a quiet visit to the site of the old public works yard where I remembered leaving something for a future I could not yet name. Before dusk, I drove past the tower one more time. The banners were gone. The guard who had escorted me out the day before stood by the revolving door, face blank, doing the job he was paid to do. He did not recognize me or pretended not to. I respected the pretending. I stood across the street and looked not at the glass but at the ground-level panels where the builders had placed a dedication plaque. From where I stood, I could not read the names carved into it, but I knew the list included everyone the day's speeches required and excluded those who had poured the load-bearing truth. People walked past, glancing up, never down. I memorized the panel's position, counting paces between door and curb the way surveyors count when the tape is still in the truck. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store that still sells rope by the foot and bolts by the handful. The owner, a man who knew wrist strength by handshake, had posted a faded photograph of workers from my era near the register. I bought red carpenter's string and a pack of grease pencils. The string is 4 straight lines when the eye gets tired. The grease pencils leave marks that even rain resists. The clerk asked whether I was fixing something. I said I was. He smiled in the way men do when they respect the answer, even if they don't know the job. Back in the house, I strung the red line from the tracing of the foundation to the stack of trust documents and anchored it with pushpins, a literal line from what holds a building up to what holds a man down. The image looked almost theatrical, and I considered taking it down, but then I thought about the value of a clear diagram. An honest drawing keeps lies from finding purchase. I pinned the index card agenda underneath and closed the notebook. On the porch again, I watched the last light snag on the roof lines across the street. Somewhere in the city, my daughter was finishing dinner and rinsing wine glasses, and my son-in-law was reviewing emails that use words like runway and dilution and stakeholder. Somewhere else, my grandson was trying to write an equation that balances respect with truth. And somewhere simple and deep below all of us, concrete that I had specified at 4,000 phi was still curing, still growing denser in the dark, still holding everything that rests on it without demanding thanks. I went to bed with the window cracked and the night air sliding in like water under a door. Sleep came in slabs. When I awoke near midnight, the house was silent. I sat up, pulled a notebook close, and wrote one line under the day's entries. The ground remembers. Then I put the pen away and lay down again, not as a man defeated, but as a man who understands that the only way out of a structure is through the load path. Tomorrow would bring city records, archived plans, careful letters, and a walk along the edge of a site I had not visited in a lifetime. If someone had placed me under guardianship without the dignity of my consent, then the least I could do was put the truth under oath. The silence inside my house had grown into something with weight. something that sat on the furniture and pressed against the windows. I tried to fill it with work, with the habit of order. I lined up the papers from the bank, squared the corners of the notebook pages, sharpened the pencils until their points looked like tools that could pierce steel. But none of it erased what I had learned, that I lived on money funneled through a trust designed to keep me dependent, and that my own daughter's hand had steadied the pen when those documents were signed. I wanted to believe Ethan would give me a different truth. The boy had grown in my shadow once. He had carried blocks for me in the backyard, asked questions about load and span, about why bridges curved instead of stand straight. If there was a place in the family where honesty could still breathe, I thought it might be in him. So I called, and his voice on the phone was uneasy, the tone of someone torn between duty and loyalty. He agreed to meet that afternoon at a diner near the university campus. When I walked in, I saw him at a booth, jacket folded beside him, textbooks stacked in a way that looked more like a wall than a study session. He stood to shake my hand, formal, almost apologetic. His eyes didn't quite meet mine until we sat down. The waitress poured coffee and left menus neither of us opened. I asked about school. He said classes were demanding, professors respected hard work, and he had joined a research group. His words were clipped, rehearsed. He mentioned a scholarship that had eased the burden. I asked the sponsor's name, though I already knew what was coming. He hesitated, then said it. A foundation funded through Mark's company, the same man who had thrown me out of a building now paid for my grandson's education. Ethan spoke quickly, explaining that he hadn't known at first that the award letter had looked like any other academic recognition. Only later had he realized the source, and by then he had already signed acceptance forms. He admitted he had signed his name again on project documentation for a civic presentation, his contribution minor, but still tied to Mark's company. He looked down at his hands as if they carried stains no sink could wash off. The words pressed against my chest like a steel beam settling into place. It wasn't betrayal in the way Claire's silence had been. It was something softer, sadder. He had been maneuvered, offered opportunity disguised as generosity, and he had taken it because refusing would have seemed foolish. Now the chain was tight, linking him to the same man who had made me a ghost. I told him not to justify it, not to build excuses out of bricks too weak to stand. He said he wanted to believe the scholarship was clean, that maybe it was Mark's attempt at goodwill, but even as he said it, his voice broke. He admitted his father had warned him not to tell me, that I would twist it into an accusation. That word struck harder than the rest. I saw how easily stories could be shaped in that household, how carefully language had been bent so that truth became distortion and distortion became truth. He asked if I hated him. I said no, hate was a waste of steel on a foundation that already carried too much load. But I told him I hated the arrangement that had put him in this position, that had turned a bright boy into a pawn on someone else's board. He nodded, silent. The waitress refilled our cups and retreated without asking if we wanted food. She must have recognized tension when it sat at a table. We left the diner together. Outside, students crossed the street, backpacks, heavy voices, bright with the carelessness of youth. I watched Ethan blend among them for a moment, then stop and turn back. He asked what I planned to do. I said I would keep building a record, that I would line up facts the way surveyors line up stakes, until no one could argue where the boundary lay. He asked if I would drag his parents through the courts. I told him I didn't yet know. His face showed relief and worry at the same time, a contradiction that fit his age perfectly. Driving home, I passed the bridge I had worked on in my 40s. Cars streamed across it, oblivious to the math and sweat beneath their tires. I thought about Ethan driving across it someday, never realizing his tuition had been paid by a man who took credit for structures like this. The road bent toward the horizon, steady, but my mind kept circling back to the scholarship, the signatures, the way opportunity had been WEAPONIZED. At the house, I laid out the diner receipt beside the bank statements, not for proof there. Was nothing incriminating in a receipt for 2 coffees, but as a marker in the timeline. A reminder of the day I learned my grandson's education came with a price tag written in my erasure. I opened the notebook and drew a line between Claire's name and Ethan's, connecting them both back to Mark. The diagram was beginning to look like a structural drawing, a web of forces pushing down on one central column, me and every column. No matter how strong, can buckle if the load is multiplied and the bracing removed. Night settled. I sat with the lights low, the notebook open. I forced myself not to drift too deep into self-pity. 10% of a man's life can be reflection. The rest must be action. I sharpened another pencil, wrote down the questions that needed answers. How had Mark accessed my old design documents? Which city department had signed off on the trust? What witness records existed from the notary's office? And, perhaps, hardest of all, how much of my family's silence was fear, and how much was choice? The next morning, I found an envelope slid under my front door. No stamp, no address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed and unsigned. It was a copy of an internal memo from Mark's firm, referencing the scholarship program. At the bottom, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Ask about Ethan's project contribution." I didn't recognize the handwriting. I sat at the table, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Someone inside Mark's world had sent this. Someone who knew I was searching, who wanted me to keep digging. I folded the memo into the notebook, marked the page with red carpenter's string, and closed it carefully. If the first lesson of building is that every foundation must hold, the second is that cracks always appear first where the weight is heaviest. My family had become the structure under load, and the cracks were showing. What I needed now was to follow them down to their source, to trace the fractures to the hidden place where truth still waited, buried in concrete, waiting to be uncovered. That night, as I stood on the porch and looked at the tower miles away, its light stabbing the sky, I whispered a promise that no one heard. I would not be written out of the ground I had signed. They could erase my name from plaques, redirect my pension, shame me in front of strangers, even recruit my grandson into their orbit. But the ground remembers, and so would I. The envelope from the trust firm lay on my table like a slab of concrete poured without warning, sealing me into a space I hadn't chosen. I needed more than bank printouts and unsigned memos. I needed city records, documents, that still carried the weight of seal and statute. So I drove downtown to the municipal offices, the place where paper outlives the men who sign it. The building was the same as when I had walked those halls as a young engineer submitting site reports. The tile floors had been polished, the lighting changed, but the smell of paper and dust clung to the air like an old worker who never punched out. At the records desk, I asked for access to archived project files from the 70s and 80s. The clerk squinted at me, not dismissive, but cautious, as if my request was unusual. He asked me to wait while he called a supervisor. A door opened, and in walked someone I had not seen in over a decade. Her hair was shorter, streaked with grey, but her walk was the same, steady, brisk, with the authority of someone who had measured twice and cut once all her life. It was Janet Monroe, a colleague from my years on the city's infrastructure projects. She had been one of the few women on site back then, a surveyor with a sharper eye than most of the men. Now she wore the badge of a city inspector, and the years had given her presence instead of diminishing it. She recognized me before I spoke. "Henry," she said, not with surprise, but with a tone that carried both memory and warning. She led me down a corridor into an office lined with file cabinets and closed the door. "You shouldn't be here without knowing what you're walking into," she said. I told her I was looking for project records, specifically foundation designs from the old public works yard and the early proposals for downtown redevelopment. She listened without interrupting, then pulled open a drawer and drew out a thick folder. She set it on the table between us, her hand resting on it as if deciding whether to let go. "Your name's in these files," she said, "but so is Mark's company. He submitted revisions 5 years ago, citing legacy designs as part of his intellectual property. The city approved them because the originals were signed and archived. Your signature gave him cover." I stared at the folder. She opened it and spread the pages. My handwriting was there, the pencil notes in the margins, the calculations I could still trace with my finger. Then newer pages, stamped with Mark's company logo, claiming the old designs as proprietary material acquired through partnership. My name had been reduced to a line in the references, cited like a footnote in his success. I asked how the city had allowed it. She shrugged, not in indifference, but in exhaustion. Because it looked clean. The paperwork matched. No one questions an archive when the signatures line up. And you weren't there to contest it. The words struck deeper than any insult. I hadn't been there because I trusted the permanence of ink and the integrity of institutions. But permanence is a lie. Paper bends to whoever holds it. Janet leaned back in her chair, studying me. "You're not losing your mind, Henry. Don't let them tell you otherwise. But you're in a fight where perception counts more than truth. They're already whispering that you're confused, that age has caught you. I've heard it in meetings." Felt my jaw tighten. The whispers had already begun, seeded like cracks in concrete, spreading quiet but certain. She slid a smaller folder across the desk. Inside were internal city memos, correspondence between departments, and one letter that froze my breath. It was from Claire, sent 2 years earlier, thanking the planning board for streamlining her father's legacy into a modern framework through her husband's firm. Her words were polished, professional, but to me they read like a betrayal, chiseled into stone. She had vouched for him, lent the weight of family to his claim, and the city had accepted it without question. Janet didn't speak while I read. She let the silence do the work. When I finally looked up, she said, "You still have allies here, but you need to move carefully. Don't storm the gates. Document everything. Build your case like you'd build a bridge, piece by piece, load by load, until it can stand on its own." I thanked her. Gratitude felt too small a word, but it was all I could offer. She told me she would keep her eyes open, that if she saw anything else, she'd find a way to get it to me. She also warned me, Mark has friends in high places, and he's not afraid to use your family to silence you. Protect yourself. Walking out of City Hall, I carried copies of the documents in a folder pressed tight under my arm. The air outside smelled of exhaust and winter rain, and the skyscraper loomed in the distance, gleaming like a monument built on theft. Every step I took echoed with the weight of those papers, proof that my work had been hijacked with the help of the very daughter I had believed I was protecting all my life. At home, I spread the documents on the table next to the bank printouts and Ethan's scholarship memo. The pattern was forming, the structure of deceit standing taller with every piece. My name was there, but hollowed out, stripped of credit, used as scaffolding for someone else's rise. I traced the lines of my old design and the signatures beneath. I could see how Mark had woven himself into the fabric of my work, claiming not just the product, but the story. That night, I sat in the dark with only the glow of a desk lamp. I copied the letter Claire had written into my notebook, line by line, each stroke of the pen burning deeper. She had not only known what Mark was doing, she had endorsed it. The betrayal was no longer silence. It was participation. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. I forced myself to breathe steady, to remember Janet's words. Build it like a bridge. Anger is fire, but bridges are built with steel and calculation. If I wanted to reclaim the truth, I had to resist the urge to burn and instead learn to weld. Before bed, I stood at the window looking toward the distant lights of the city. The tower stood there, glowing against the night, its base anchored in foundations I had drawn decades ago. Somewhere beneath that concrete lay the capsule I had buried, sealed in steel, carrying more than designs. It carried my handwriting, my convictions, and a message meant for a time when I might no longer be there to defend myself. That time had come. They had erased my name on paper, stolen my pension, twisted my daughter's loyalty, and pulled my grandson into their orbits. But deep in the ground, under layers of steel and stone, the truth waited. And I was not done. The folder from Janet had left a mark on me, heavier than any blueprint I had ever carried. Yet it wasn't the stamped seals or the signatures that haunted me most. It was the memory of another seal, one not issued by the city but by my own hand, sunk deep into the concrete of a site decades ago. I remembered lowering a capsule into the foundation of a municipal maintenance building, a time when hope was still stronger than doubt. Inside I had placed not just diagrams, but a letter Ruth had written, sealed in steel to outlast both of us. For weeks I had ignored the tug of that memory, convincing myself the capsule was unreachable, buried under layers of stone and progress. But after Janet's warning, after reading my daughter's words to city officials, I could no longer silence the thought. If anything still bore the weight of truth uncorrupted, it was down there, in the dark, where no revision could erase it. I drove to the site at dawn when the city was quiet and parked where the old yard had once stood. The maintenance building had been razed years ago. In its place rose part of Mark's project, a sleek plaza of steel and glass, polished for investors, hollow to me. The exact spot where the capsule lay was now paved with concrete tiles and benches for office workers on break. I walked the perimeter, counting steps, tracing the geometry like I had done so many years before. My hands moved unconsciously, measuring angles, as though the ghost of my younger self stood beside me with a transit. I knew I couldn't dig there, not yet. But the thought that beneath this polished surface, Ruth's words and my drawings still existed, pressed against my chest like a heartbeat I couldn't reach. I whispered her name under my breath, half prayer, half memory. For a moment I could hear her laugh, sharp and knowing, the sound of someone who saw through pretense. Back at home, I opened the old notebook where I had sketched the capsule's placement years ago. The leather cover had grown stiff, the pages worn, but the marks were still there. Next to the sketch, I had taped a copy of Ruth's letter, not the one in the capsule, but a draft she had left on the kitchen table before sealing the final. I had never reread it fully, perhaps out of cowardice, perhaps out of reverence. That morning, I forced myself to unfold the brittle page. Her handwriting was steady, though the ink had faded. She wrote about the long nights I spent at sites, about the empty chairs at dinners, about the weight she carried raising Claire when I was buried in calculations and deadlines. She had praised my devotion to the city, but confessed that devotion had carved gaps in our own walls. The words weren't cruel. They were wary, truthful. She had written that she hoped, someday, I would remember not only the bridges I built, but the family I crossed over to get there. Reading it felt like standing on scaffolding that swayed underfoot. I had told myself for years that my sacrifices were noble, that working double shifts and signing away time was for the good of my family. But her words stripped away that illusion. I had given Claire opportunity, but I had also left her with absence. And now she had chosen to side with the man who promised her permanence where I had given only plans. The room seemed smaller as I folded the letter back into the notebook. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the realization that I wasn't only a victim in this story. I had built the conditions that allowed my daughter to look elsewhere for solidity. That didn't excuse her betrayal, but it framed it differently. It made the wound deeper because it wasn't only inflicted from the outside, it was shaped by cracks I had left unpatched long ago. That night, I dreamed of Ruth. She stood on the half-built span of a bridge, wind whipping her hair, the river black beneath. She called my name, not in anger, but in sorrow, and the sound carried through steel beams like an echo that would never stop. When I woke, the echo stayed. I returned to the plaza the next day, not to dig, but to watch. Workers swept the pavement. Office employees smoked near the benches. Pedestrians hurried past. None of them knew what lay beneath their feet. To them, it was just stone and soil. To me, it was a tomb and a vault, holding the only unaltered truth left. I sat on a bench, my notebook open on my lap, sketching the outline of the plaza, marking where the capsule lay. A young maintenance worker approached, asking if I was lost. I told him I had worked on the old building here, long before his time. He smiled politely, uninterested in history, and moved on. That brief exchange carried a sting sharper than dismissal. It reminded me how easily memory is erased when it isn't anchored. Mark understood that. He built monuments, not of stone, but of narrative, rewriting who laid the first foundation until people believed him. I couldn't let Ruth's letter stay buried forever. Her words deserved daylight, not shadow. Yet to bring them up, I would need more than a shovel. I would need timing, leverage, and allies. Janet could help with the city permits. Ethan, if he could free himself from his father's scholarship. Chains might one day stand with me, but Clara didn't know if her heart still carried even a fragment of the girl Ruth and I had raised. That evening, I opened the notebook again and wrote a line beneath Ruth's draft. The ground remembers. The foundation keeps the truth even when the surface lies. I pressed the pencil so hard the lead snapped, but the words remained. The betrayal of my family cut deep, but Ruth's voice from the past cut deeper still. She reminded me that my battle wasn't only against Mark's theft or Claire's silence. It was against the very narrative I had built about myself. To expose him, I would also have to expose my own failings. Only then would her letter carry the weight it deserved, not as an indictment, but as proof that truth, however painful, endures. I closed the notebook, placed it on the table beside the folders from Janet, and sat in the dim light. For the first time in years, I spoke Ruth's name aloud, not as memory, but as witness. And in that quiet room, I promised her that the capsule she sealed with her words would not remain buried forever. By the time the city began whispering that I was losing my mind, the weight of their suspicion pressed heavier than any steel girder I had ever lifted. Mark had orchestrated it with the ease of a man who knew how to manipulate both boardrooms and living rooms. A single phrase uttered in the right ears. He's confused. Age is catching up. And suddenly, my every pause. In a sentence, every moment I searched for a word was evidence of decline. I could see it in their eyes when I walked into the grocery store. The hesitation, the tilt of the head, the pity disguised as courtesy. It was in that suffocating atmosphere that I found myself sitting in the back pew of St. Brigid's on a Tuesday afternoon. The church was nearly empty. The only sound, the hum of a distant vacuum and the faint creak of the wooden rafters. I hadn't come seeking faith. I had come seeking silence, a space where Mark's voice couldn't reach. But silence rarely stays unbroken from the side altar. Father O'Neill emerged, the man who had baptized Claire when she was still small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. Time had carved deeper lines into his face, but his eyes retained the same piercing steadiness. He didn't ask why I was there. He simply sat beside me, the pew groaning under our combined weight, and waited. I told him more than I had told anyone. About the capsule buried under the plaza. About Ruth's letter still sealed in steel. About Claire's signature on documents. That handed my savings to Mark. My words came not as a confession, but as a report, laid out with the precision of blueprints, each fact another beam in the structure of betrayal. When I finished, I sat rigid, my hands gripping the bench as though it might carry me through the storm. He looked ahead at the crucifix, silent for a long while. Then, in that steady voice I remembered from funerals and weddings alike, he said, "Concrete can hold for a century, Henry, but memory is even stronger. And when memory is buried, it festers. The truth doesn't vanish because men build over it. The truth waits." The words struck me harder than any of Mark's slanders. Truth waits. Ruth's letter had waited. My own negligence had waited. And now both rose from the ground to confront me. I had spent weeks obsessing over Mark's theft, Claire's betrayal, Ethan's wavering loyalty, but I had given less thought to the fact that the world had already been watching me long before. Mark's schemes. To them, my legacy was not only what I had built, but what I had neglected. I asked him, almost against my will, "And what if the truth damns me as much as it saves me?" He turned his head then, eyes meeting mine without flinching. "Then you accept it, and in that acceptance lies your strength. The people who try to bury you will use your silence as the final shovelful of dirt. Don't give them that satisfaction. Speak, even if it cuts both ways." That night, his words echoed in me like a tolling bell. Speak, do not remain buried. I pulled Ruth's draft letter from my notebook and read it aloud in my empty kitchen as though reciting to a jury only. I could see. I didn't stop when my throat tightened, or when the shame made me want to fold the paper back into silence. I spoke every line, every accusation she had etched in ink, and in doing so, I felt both smaller and stronger. The next day, I drove again, to the plaza, but this time I didn't sit as a silent observer. I approached the site foreman, a man who hadn't been alive when I drew the original designs, and asked if excavation permits still existed for the foundation beneath. He laughed, dismissive, until I showed him the pages from my old notebook. The seal of the city stamped decades ago, my name inked in steady letters before arthritis bent my hand. His laughter faded then, replaced by unease. That reaction confirmed something I had suspected. Mark had kept my name in shadows because the project was built on its bones. If the capsule surfaced, if Ruth's letter came into daylight, his entire story collapsed. It wasn't only about family anymore. It was about power, about control of history itself. I went home with a strange calm. Mark could call me senile. Claire could call me a burden. Ethan could stand uncertain in the middle, but none of them could change the fact that steel still rested under the ground, waiting. And when it came up, it would not only indict them, it would indict me too. That was the price. That evening, I wrote again in the notebook. Not sketches this time, not coordinates, but a single sentence. The foundation remembers longer than flesh, and longer than lies. I underlined it twice, then closed the book with hands steadier than they had been in weeks. Father O'Neill's words carried me into sleep that night. The truth waits, and I resolved that when it surfaced, I would not cower. I would let her read aloud whatever verdict it held, because in that pain lay the one weapon Mark couldn't touch, honesty, sharper than any accusation. The battle ahead would not be won with fists or lawsuits. It would be won by opening the ground itself, and letting the buried voices speak. And when they did, no amount of security guards or polished speeches could silence them. I knew the time for silence had passed when I saw my name printed in a local newsletter under the headline, "Retired Engineer Suffers Decline. Family Urges Compassion." It was Mark's handiwork, no doubt. He had weaponized pity, turned my years of labor into a caricature of fragility. People were meant to see me as a relic, not a witness. That headline was not just a smearit, was a lock on the vault where he thought he could keep the truth hidden. But he had underestimated how steel under pressure doesn't crack. It hardens. I went first to the city records office. Janet had left me with enough breadcrumbs in our last conversation to know where to dig. In the basement archive, under fluorescent lights buzzing with age, I pulled files whose edges were yellowed but still sharp. There it was, my signature, clean and deliberate, affixed to permits that had been resubmitted in recent years. I knew the date by heart. I hadn't signed anything past 2008. Yet here was my name neatly scrawled in ink dated 2019. The forgery wasn't clumsy. It was precise, practiced. He had used my history as his scaffolding. I took photographs of every page, methodical as I once was when inspecting a bridge for cracks. Each click of the camera was another rivet, another piece of armor for the fight to come. Still, I knew documentation alone wouldn't topple him. I needed the ground itself to testify, so I went back to the plaza at dawn, long before the crew arrived. The plaza was quiet then, the steel and glass towers reflecting the pale sky. No crowd, no speeches, just concrete over earth that still remembered. I walked to the corner where I knew the capsule had been buried 40 years ago. My hands traced the joints of the paving stones, my eyes measuring the distance from the fountain to the perimeter wall. Engineers never forget dimensions. They become part of the body. And in that moment, I could feel Ruth's words waiting under my boots, demanding to be read by a world that had forgotten her voice. I rented equipment under another Nemar, small hydraulic drill, a cart, tarps. The clerk didn't look twice. To him, I was just another contractor's errand. That evening, when shadows stretched long across the plaza, I began. It was slow work, each inch of stone lifted like a confession. My back screamed in protest, but my will was iron. By midnight, the soil gave way, and the edge of steel appeared. The capsule, just as I remembered, it seems rusted but intact. I didn't open it then. That moment was not mine alone to take. It belonged to the city, to history, even to Mark, though he would curse its existence. I cleaned the surface with my sleeve and replaced the soil carefully, covering it enough to avoid suspicion, but marking the coordinates in my notebook with precision. The next morning, I sent an anonymous tip to the local paper, evidence of a time capsule beneath the Callahan Plaza, possibly containing original blueprints and documents of civic significance. I knew curiosity would do what outrage could not. Journalists could not resist the promise of something buried, something that might rewrite the story. But I wasn't done. I requested a meeting with the city council, invoking my old credentials, my projects still standing across the state. They agreed reluctantly, their expressions skeptical, their patience thin. When I laid the photographs of forged signatures on the table, there was a flicker in their eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the glimmer of doubt. Bureaucrats didn't care for drama, but they feared liability. And liability was the one language Mark couldn't entirely control. Word spread faster than I anticipated. By the time Mark learned of it, the council had already scheduled a formal excavation for the following week, public and documented. His call came not to me, but to Claire. She showed up at my door that night, her face hard with exhaustion and anger. She accused me of trying to ruin her husband, of seeking attention I didn't deserve. And then, with a bitterness that pierced deeper than any headline, she said, "You were never there for us when we needed you, and now you want to play hero." I didn't answer immediately. Her words were not lies. They were wounds reopened. I had chosen blueprints over birthdays, deadlines over dinners. Ruth had carried the weight I had set aside. To deny it would have been cowardice. But I also knew that acknowledging my failures did not erase the theft of my name. I told her plainly, "I failed you as a father more than once, but I did not sign away my life's work to be consumed by your husband's ambition. The ground will speak, Claire, whether you stand with me or against me." She left without another word. The slam of the door echoed long into the night, a sound more final than any verdict. But in that silence, I also realized something. This fight was no longer about me alone. It was about every man and woman whose labor had been erased, whose names had been replaced by others with more money, more connections. If I allowed Mark's story to stand, then I was complicit in the erasure not only of my work, but of an entire generation that had built with their hands and not their software. On Sunday, I returned to St. Brigid's. Father O'Neill stood at the lectern, his voice carrying over the small congregation. I waited until the end, then approached him. I told him the capsule had been found, that Ruth's words were about to surface. He placed his hand on mine and said, "Then let them rise. The living and the dead both deserve the truth." Those words steeled me. I was ready now, not only for Mark's fury, but for the city's judgment, for Ruth's accusation written in her hand, for Ethan's confusion when he saw that both his father and his grandfather bore guilt of different kinds. I was ready to let the steel capsule breathe again. When the excavation came, it would not simply reveal the foundation of a plaza. It would reveal the foundation of lies, of sacrifices buried, of voices silenced. And when it did, I would be there, not hidden, not ashamed, but standing. Even if the ground opened beneath my feet, the truth waits, Father O'Neill had said. And now it was about to speak. The morning of the excavation was heavy with clouds, as if the sky itself anticipated confrontation. I stood at the perimeter of the plaza, near the barricades the city had erected for crowd control. Reporters gathered with cameras, neighbors murmured with curiosity, workers prepared their equipment. It should have been a moment of vindication, yet I sensed the ambush before I saw it. Mark arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, flanked by lawyers in tailored suits and a group of his employees who looked less like engineers and more like enforcers. He strode across the plaza with the arrogance of a man convinced the ground belonged to him. The cameras pivoted to catch him, and he smiled as if greeting admirers at a gala. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice amplified by portable speakers his team had hastily set up. "This excavation is not about history. It's about a confused old man clinging to memories. He has been manipulated, and I will not stand by while the reputation of this city or my company is dragged through the mud." A ripple went through the crowd. I heard my name whispered alongside. The word senile, exactly the seed he had been planting. I stepped forward, refusing to let his performance go unanswered. "That capsule was buried long before your company existed. It belongs to the people, not to your vanity. Open it and let the truth speak." He turned toward me with a smile so polished it could have been carved from stone. "Truth, Henry. You mean the same truth you abandoned your family for. The truth that left your wife alone, your daughter ashamed, your grandson doubting whether you ever cared." The words hit harder than any fist. I saw Claire behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes avoiding mine. And there, half a step back, Ethan, jaw tight, his body tense as if caught between two fronts of a war he never chose. Mark gestured to his lawyer, who raised a packet of papers. "Court order," the man declared. "Filed last night, preventing any unauthorized excavation until questions of ownership and safety are resolved. Digging into this plaza could compromise the structural integrity of the foundation." The timing was no accident. He had anticipated every move, filed at the last possible moment to stall. The crowd began to shift, uneasy. Some jeered, others murmured support for him. A reporter shoved a microphone in my face, demanding to know if I really was suffering memory loss. I did not flinch. "If you believe I'm mistaken, dig it up and prove me wrong. But you won't, because you know what lies beneath doesn't belong to you." Mark's expression hardened, the smile cracking at the edges. He raised his hand as if to signal security again, just as he had at the dedication weeks ago. For a moment, I thought he would humiliate me a second time, drag me away in front of the city, but then Ethan stepped forward. "Stop," he said, his voice carrying in the silence that followed. Everyone turned. For the first time, my grandson wasn't hiding behind either of us. He looked directly at his father. "If there's nothing to hide, then why not let them open it?" The air shifted. Reporters seized on his words, cameras flashing, pens scratching across notepads. Mark's jaw tightened, his hand frozen mid-gesture. Claire's face flushed with anger, torn between loyalty and disbelief. But Ethan didn't look at me with triumph or support. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw only conflict. He was not standing for me. He was standing for his own need, too. See the truth. And in that gaze, I also saw a fracture, one that could break either way. Mark recovered quickly, drawing Ethan to his side with a firm grip on his shoulder. "You're young," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "And sometimes the young don't understand what's at stake. This is about safety, responsibility, and protecting our city, not indulging fantasies." The crowd, restless now, pressed against the barricades. Some shouted that the capsule should be opened, others echoed Mark's warnings about safety. City officials huddled near the equipment, uncertain whether to proceed. I reached into my coat and pulled out my old notebook, the leather worn, the pages smudged with decades of graphite and ink. Holding it high, I let the cameras capture it. This is my record of every calculation, every drawing, every detail of that plaza when it was built. In it is the exact location of the capsule and proof that it was placed there as part of the dedication ceremony. The foundation will hold. I would stake my life on it. A hush fell. For a moment, even the reporters seemed caught between spectacle and reverence. The notebook, dismissed for years as a relic, suddenly had the weight of testimony. Mark's face darkened. "That's a scribbler's diary," he sneered. "It has no legal authority." I stepped closer, so close that the crowd could see the distance between us was nothing but breath and conviction. Maybe not, but this city is built on men and women who recorded their work in books just like this. If their word is worthless, then so is every brick you're standing on. For a flicker of a second, I saw him falter. Then, with cold precision, he delivered the blow he had been holding in reserve. "Ask your daughter," he said, turning the crowd's attention toward Claire. "She signed over your accounts years ago. Every bill you've paid, every meal you've eaten these last few years, my company covered it. Without me, Henry, you wouldn't have a roof over your head. Tell them how independent you are then." The words detonated like dynamite under the plaza. Gasps rippled. Cameras swung to Claire, who froze like a deer in headlights. I felt the weight of humiliation press down, heavier than the years on my shoulders. The murmurs grew sharp. "He's living off them, he's bitter. Maybe he is just confused." But before the moment could collapse entirely, Ethan tore himself free from his father's grip. "That may be true," he shouted, "but it doesn't change what's buried under there." His voice cracked, but it cut through the noise like a steel beam through fog. For the first time, Mark looked unsettled. He barked orders to his security detail, but the city officials hesitated, caught between two narratives, both equally charged. The excavation was suspended, postponed to a council vote. The crowd dispersed in chaos, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, neighbors debating heatedly as they walked away. I was left standing in the shadow of the plaza, the notebook clutched against my chest. I had not won, but neither had he. The capsule was still in the ground, waiting. And as long as it waited, the fight was not over. That night, alone in my kitchen, I stared at the notebook under the dim light. My hand trembled as I traced Ruth's name on one of the earliest pages, where she had written it absent-mindedly years ago when she brought me coffee. She had lived with the weight of my absence, and soon her letter would rise to accuse me. But better her truth than his lies. Mark had thought today would bury me once and for all. Instead, it had set the stage. The foundation had been cracked, not of the plaza, but of his empire. All that was left was for the earth itself to open, and when it did, no paper, no speech, no lawyer would be able to hold it shut by the time the vote cleared at City Hall. The plaza had already turned into a viewing window over buried time. Crews set up barricades before sunrise, chalked a grid across the papers, and marked the coordinates I had submitted with Jeanette's affidavit. Reporters clustered behind a rope line. Office workers gathered on the steps with paper cups, pretending to be late for meetings. I stood off to the side with my leather notebook under my arm, close enough to see, far enough to let the work speak first. The city engineer read a brief statement, then signaled the foreman. The first slab came up clean, suction lifter hissing, as the stone separated from mortar with a soft pop. A compact coring rig bit into the sub-base, spitting grey slurry into a tray. When the bit punched through the setting bed, the foreman switched to hand tools. The crew scraped in careful arcs, shaving inches as if they were barbers to the earth. The crowd's chatter thinned into a taut silence. I counted the strokes without meaning to. On the sixth pass, a steel edge flashed in the hole. The foreman brushed away the grit with a gloved knuckle and nodded. They widened the opening and fitted lifting straps. The capsule rose slowly, coated in the fine dust of a life lived underground. Even from 20 feet, I recognized the weld seam, the small bevel at one end where I had ground the lip before sealing. Time had darkened the metal, but not its shape. Mark arrived late and loud, lawyers beside him, a camera crew in tow. He started talking before he reached the rope line, laying down the same arguments he had rehearsed for weeks: chain of custody, public safety, malicious interference with commerce. He asked the city engineer who would accept liability if the excavation damaged the plaza. The engineer didn't answer. He was looking at the capsule, not at Mark. The foreman set it on a rolling cart and wheeled it to a folding table. A city archivist clipped a scope to the seam, peered through, and announced the obvious: welded shut. No evidence of recent tampering. A notary read the case number into a microphone. 2 officials initialed the chain of custody form. The archivist took a die grinder, touched it to the seam, and the first sparks of morning jumped like small fireworks. The weld line gave a reluctant sigh and split. A smell escaped old paper and oil, and everyone leaned in by instinct. Inside lay what I remembered and what I feared: rolled vellum tubes tied with cotton string, a cloth-wrapped bundle, and a small metal tin. The archivist lifted the vellum first, untying the string with careful fingers and spreading the sheets across the table. The top drawing was the foundation plan for the maintenance building that had once stood here, the same hand that lived. In my notebook, my hand, each bearing the city's stamp and the date. My name at the title block hadn't faded. The room noise shifted. Admiration isn't loud. The archivist opened the tin. A Polaroid rested on top. Me on a younger day in a hard hat, arm around Ruth. 3 laborers crowded behind us, grinning through dust. A steel cylinder sat at our feet with fresh weld blued by heat. Someone had scrawled the date in marker across the white border, the ink feathered by time. The archivist placed the photos beside the drawings, and cameras leaned in as if pulled. Then, the cloth-wrapped bundle. The archivist loosened the knot and unfolded it to reveal a stack of pages tied with twine. She cleared her throat and said this looked like a letter. The council chair asked whether I wished to claim it. I shook my head. Let the city read it. Let the city hear both the accusation and the defense in a single voice that no longer needed permission. The archivist read. Ruth's words were steady as the day she wrote them. She described nights when I didn't come home, dinners kept warm, and thrown away, a daughter asleep on the couch with a book across her chest. She wrote that she loved a man who loved his work so fiercely it eclipsed his home. She wrote that she believed the structures I designed would keep people safe long after we were gone, and because of that belief, she had sealed this letter in steel. She asked that if our names were ever misused, this record correct the story. She asked that if I ever forgot my family in pursuit of a drawing, I be reminded by the ground itself. No one interrupted. Phones stopped recording. People watched with their eyes. Even Mark's counsel looked down. The archivist set the final page beside the photo and exhaled like a man who had finished a heavy lift. Mark pushed to the front. He used the last tool. He had left. He questioned authenticity, demanded technical proofs, pointed to the fact that a letter is not a legal instrument. He tried to laugh off the photograph as a staged sentiment. He insisted the drawings proved nothing about ownership, only that I had contributed to a public project. His voice had lost its polish. The edges showed. It isn't easy to sell certainty when truth sits open on a table. I asked to speak. The council chair hesitated, then motioned to the small lectern. An officer moved to escort me through the rope line. The security supervisor raised a hand to stop him. He looked at me closely, the way men look when they turn memory over in their minds. Then he smiled with half his mouth. "You signed my first sight badge." "Sir," he said quietly, not for the microphones. "City Yard, winter of '86. You told me to keep my boots dry and my oath clean." He stepped aside and let me pass. Mark saw it. The crowd felt it. A humiliation returned to sender without a single shove. I stood at the lectern with Ruth's letter in view. The drawings spread like a map of everything I had been and failed to be. I spoke without theatrics. I said I had built structures I believed would outlast me. I said I had also left absences that hurt the people who carried my name. I said I had given the original design to the city to use and improve and share. I said no one had the right to erase the people who did the work or to hijack their names for profit. I said the capsule held two truths at once, my contribution and my neglect. Both were facts, and both mattered. I asked the council to correct the record, to restore proper attribution on public plaques, and to establish a permanent archive of field notes and crew lists from projects like this, naming the workers whose hands got wet. Finally, I relinquished any claim to royalties. I asked for this, that the Tower Plaza carry a dedication to the crews of the old yard. If my name returned, let it return as one among many, not above them. Silence, then uncertain, the sound people make when something plain cuts through. The council went into brief session. Mark tried to follow. The clerk blocked him. Reporters swarmed the table to photograph the drawings again. Janet caught my eye from the side and gave a single nod. Father O'Neill stood near the back, hands folded, expression unreadable but steady. The council returned 15 minutes later. The chair read the motion. The city would record the capsule's contents as official historical material. Restore attribution on any public interface referencing the plan. And recommend the plaza dedication be amended to include the field crews listed in appended site logs. A second motion noted credible concerns regarding the reuse of archival materials by Mark's company and referred them to the Inspector General. The vote was unanimous. Mark lunged for the microphones. The words came fast and jagged. This was a witch hunt, a municipal overreach, an attack on enterprise. His general counsel tugged at his sleeve. The cameras were still recording when a young reporter asked one, calm question. Why did you file an emergency injunction to prevent opening the capsule if you had nothing to fear? He didn't answer. There are questions that don't need force. They just need air. Phones chimed across the plaza almost in unison, news alerts. Someone read aloud. His board had announced an emergency session for that afternoon. Another message followed minutes later. The board had voted to place him on administrative leave, pending review. The plaza murmured the way crowds do when they sense a balance shifting. Mark's face drained. For once, he looked his age. Claire stood on the step behind him, pale. She wasn't looking at me or at the ground. She was looking at the photograph of younger us and the letter with her mother's hand. She took one step toward the lectern, stopped, and turned to the council chair. Her voice was small but clear. She confirmed the mail had gone to her house. During my rehab, she said she had believed she was helping. She said she now understood what help looks like when it's convenient for the helper. The words fractured as she spoke them, but she finished. The council thanked her for the statement and logged it. Ethan did not come to my side or his father's. He walked to the table, picked up the Polaroid under the archivist's supervision, and stared at it as if trying to memorize a language. He had only just decided to learn. Then he put it down gently and stepped back to the neutral ground between us. Security approached Mark, not theatrical, not rough procedural. The supervisor I had once cleared nodded to him, a professional courtesy wrapped around a line that could not bend. Mark brushed past, jaw set, eyes forward. He did not look at me. He had always preferred heights. The ground had never been his. Allied in the quiet that followed, the council chair invited me to sign the intake log for the archive. I opened the leather notebook and removed the page with the foundation overlay I had traced in my kitchen. I signed and dated it, then handed the notebook itself to the archivist. This belongs to the city, I said. Make it a place where young engineers can learn from old mistakes and old strengths. The archivist cradled it like a fragile instrument and promised to preserve it. Father O'Neill came to my shoulder and spoke softly. Sometimes the only way to honor the living is to listen to the dead, he said, and to yourself. By afternoon, the plaza workers lowered a temporary cover over the excavation and taped a notice announcing the forthcoming dedication. Strangers came up to shake my hand. One of the laborers from the crew, a man with concrete dust ground into his cuticles, asked if he could take a picture of the Polaroid to show his father, who had worked the yard in the 80s. He used to say your name like a measuring unit, the man said. Didn't know if it was myth or man. I told him it was both and that the measure was never meant to be a pedestal. News traveled. The board's formal statement came just before dusk. Mark removed as CEO, effective immediately. A separate notice from the city inspector's office announced an inquiry into contract representations. No celebration rose in me, just a settling, like a deck finding level. After a heavy rain, I drove home on streets that felt familiar again. In the kitchen, I set the copy of Ruth's letter beside the sink and read the last paragraph once more. She had written, "If memory fails you, let the ground remind you." Today it had. I brewed coffee, sat at the table, and wrote 3 letters. One to the council, establishing a small scholarship in Ruth's name for young people entering the trades, funded not by lawsuits, but by what I could spare. One to Ethan, enclosing a photo of the slide rule he had asked to earn, telling him he could have it when he built something that outlived both of us. One to Claire, not pleading, not accusing, Just a ledger of facts and a line that said my door was open for truth. Not performance. Before bed, I walked out to the porch. The night carried the smell of wet concrete and distant traffic. Somewhere under the city, foundations cured a little harder. The ground remembers. It always had. I have seen enough to know the difference between noise and weight. What carried the day was not anger or cleverness, but records, dates, signatures, and a steel tube that refused to lie. I did not defeat a man. I restored a line. There is more to do, dedications to amend, archives to build, a family to face without self-pity, but the path ahead is work, and work is where I have always known what to do. In the end, I asked for nothing that wasn't already true, and I gave up the only thing that could have spoiled it, the hunger to be the only name remembered. I drove home under a sky the color of rebar, and for the first time in months, I slept without holding the notebook to my chest. I will leave you with what this long route through humiliation and stone taught me, and I will speak plainly, not to be admired but to be useful. Paper is a tool, the way a beam is a tool. Keep it, date it, copy it. Do not assume love will hold the record. Rarely does. If your house is tilting because money or pride has shifted the load, stop asking for feelings and start asking for documents. When family treats your history like an inconvenience, do not rewrite yourself to fit their comfort. Draw a boundary as clean as a chalk line. This is what happened, and here is where I stand. I learned that apologies matter, but they are not a strategy. My apology to my wife and my daughter did not return what was taken, the archive did. My regret did not convince a council, the capsule did. Speak your fault in full sentences, then put your proof on the table. If you cannot win the room, win the record. And remember that sometimes the right outcome is not your name in bronze, but many names in plain letters. Because dignity shared is stronger than honor hoarded. To anyone watching who has been sidelined in their own family, I say this as a man who nearly disappeared under his own silence. You don't need rage to survive this. You need a plan. Keep your receipts. Keep your calendar. Keep your oath to yourself. If they try to shove you off the deck, check the beams and call the inspector. If they insist you imagined your own labor, invite the ground to testify. And if you find, as I did, that you were not only wronged but also wrong, tell the truth. First, it will take the last good weapon out of their hands and place it in yours. If this story steadied you even slightly, stay with us for what comes next. There are more foundations to open.